A black businessman was forced to wait for a grueling 90 minutes until his CEO's entrance rewrote the entire scene. The sleek glass doors of the bank parted with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of cool, conditioned air that swept along the bustling sidewalk. The tang of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the subtle gleam of polished leather, setting an ambience of quiet, unyielding efficiency. Dorian Bennett strode in, shoulders easing confidently beneath his impeccably tailored blazer. Never one to show hesitation, he had graced countless boardrooms, sealed landmark deals, and built his empire from nothing. His right to be in that room was indisputable, he simply needed them to recognize it. The meeting was slated for exactly 11 a.m., leaving no room for anything but absolute professionalism. The lobby itself was a study in contrasts, a fusion of modern luxury and timeless wealth, with deep mahogany desks, sleek glass partitions, and just a hint of gold catching the light to remind you that money reigned supreme. Every detail was engineered to impress. At reception, a woman with her hair pulled into a neat bun and an air of cool detachment looked up, the engraved name Melissa shone on her desk. "Welcome to Highland Crest Bank," she intoned in a clipped, mechanical manner. "Do you have an appointment?" "Dorian Bennett," he replied smoothly as he set his leather portfolio on the counter. "I have a meeting with Linda Kramer at 11. Melissa's fingers danced over her keyboard as she scanned the schedule. "You're on the list," she said flatly. "Please, have a seat, she'll be with you shortly." Nodding, Dorian drifted toward the seating area and selected a chair by the towering windows, where shafts of sunlight sliced sharply across the polished floor. Nearby, a cadre of impeccably dressed professionals gathered by the telephones, their conversation a casual murmur about market tremors and new investment opportunities, the idle banter of those who felt entirely at home. His fingers began a soft tap against his briefcase. It was only 10 a.m., he was always early. Minutes slipped away, 11:05, then 11:15. At first he let the delay slide, after all, even banks sometimes fumbled their schedules. But after 20 minutes, his keen eyes followed the steady flow of arrivals. A man in a gray suit, perhaps in his early 30s, had just checked in with Melissa. Within less than 5 minutes, a young banker emerged and led someone past the frosted glass doors into the executive offices. Soon after, a woman in a cream blazer arrived, seemingly without an appointment, sharing a light conversation with Melissa before she too was whisked away. Yet his name remained uncalled. Glancing at his watch once more, he noted it was now 11:30 a.m., something was unmistakably amiss. His fingers drummed a measured beat on the briefcase as he observed the scene. Newcomers entered with an air of belonging, warm smiles, familiar nods, brisk handshakes exchanged with the staff, while others, like him, sat quietly waiting their turn. The difference was stark, they were summoned, and he was not. 35 minutes had already passed. Despite a confirmed appointment he'd verified twice, he was still marooned in that same chair as at least 6 others had been effortlessly ushered into the executive realm. Yet Dorian remained composed. He was no stranger to such unspoken, subtle barriers that were conveniently overlooked. "Oh, we didn't mean to keep you waiting, it must have been a scheduling mix-up. So sorry about that, you know how hectic things get." The rehearsed apology might have been wrapped in politeness. Rising with a steady expression, he returned to the front desk. Melissa looked up again with that same impassive stare. "Excuse me," Dorian said, his tone calm but resolute, "has Linda Kramer been informed that I am waiting?" Melissa exhaled briefly, as if interrupted mid-thought, and resumed tapping on her keyboard without meeting his eyes. Clearly, she was busy finishing up with another client. He paused, expecting at least a hint of acknowledgement or an updated time, yet she simply returned to her work. "Do you have an estimate on when she'll be available?" he asked, holding back his irritation. Melissa barely glanced at the screen before offering a noncommittal shrug. "Shouldn't be much longer." Dorian exhaled slowly, steadying his inner calm. It wasn't merely her words, but the lack of urgency in her tone, a brushed-off response meant only to placate him. And then, right before his eyes, the scene repeated, a woman in a navy blue dress, her designer handbag swinging stylishly at her side, strode in while engaged in a light, effortless phone conversation. In an instant, Melissa's posture softened, her tone shifted, and her lips curved into what could pass as a genuine smile. "Good morning, Miss Lancaster," she said, her voice now warm and refined. Miss Lancaster offered a polite nod and, without a pause, a young banker appeared to lead her into the back offices. No waiting, no explanations, just smooth efficiency. Dorian exhaled slowly again. He had now been there for nearly an hour, though for some, it was less than a minute. Turning back to Melissa with a slight edge of discomfort, he asked, "Do appointments even count here, or is it simply first come, first served?" "I told you, sir, she'll be with you soon," she repeated, that elusive word soon echoing like a promise without commitment, a delay with no set time that masked the truth of their inaction. Dorian's eyes drifted to the frosted glass doors. It would have been easy to settle in, wait another 30 minutes, and pretend the injustice wasn't happening. But this was more than a delay, it was about respect. He forced himself to remain calm. He had built a company from nothing, weathered condescending investors, and been underestimated in boardrooms of self-assured men. Yet this moment was different. It wasn't about business plans or spreadsheets, it was about being ignored, dismissed as if his very presence held no value. Glancing at his watch, 12:05, a slow realization sank in. He scanned the lobby again, not a single other person was still waiting. Every newcomer after him had been promptly attended to or at least acknowledged, except for him. Across the room, a young teller was engaged in light, casual conversation with an older gentleman dressed in khakis and a golf polo. Tilting his head, Dorian listened as the older man chuckled, "Yeah, I told her to just walk in, she never needs an appointment, you know how it is." The teller laughed and added, "Well, for Miss Lancaster, we always make exceptions." The grip on his briefcase tightened. So that was how it worked, rules for some, different rules for others. Leaning forward with elbows on his knees, he stared down at the gleaming floor. Was this a test, to sit quietly and be brushed aside, or would he assert that his time was every bit as valuable? With measured resolve, not hurried, not aggressive, he rose and strode past the front desk, leaving Melissa's impassive expression behind as he headed directly for the frosted glass doors. "Sir," Melissa began, but he didn't pause. Pushing open the door, he stepped into a long corridor lined with private offices. Some doors stood ajar, others remained shut, but one thing was clear, Linda Kramer was not in a meeting. She sat alone at her desk, fingers tapping on her laptop. Her eyes lifted, and in an instant, her expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "Mr. Bennett," she said sharply, "you should have waited to be called." Dorian met her gaze evenly. "I did wait," he replied, noting as her fingers hovered above the keyboard and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Please, take a seat," she finally instructed. He sat, not out of deference, but by choice, while a gut feeling warned him that this conversation would not unfold on her terms. As Linda's fingers twitched while adjusting papers, Dorian noticed the subtle tension in her jaw and a fleeting spark of irritation in her eyes. "I apologize for the delays," he said with a forced smile. "We've been extremely busy today, busy." That single word hung in the air. He had seen at least 6 people swept past him like VIPs while he had languished in that lobby for over an hour and a half. "Were you?" he asked calmly yet firmly, pointing out that he'd observed clients, some without even an appointment, being attended to immediately. Linda's lips tightened further. "I assure you, Mr. Bennett, it wasn't intentional. There must have been some miscommunication, right?" "A miscommunication?" Dorian exhaled through his nose, his face remaining unreadable. "Interesting." Clearing her throat as if eager to shift the subject, Linda snapped open a folder and skimmed its contents. "Now, let's discuss your loan applications," she said, her tone reverting to that polished, dismissive cadence. "I've reviewed them, and while your financials are impressive, our criteria remain strict given the current lending climate. I'm afraid we require additional assurances before we can proceed." Before she could finish, the door swung open. Instantly, the energy in the room transformed. The once quiet hallway now thrummed with a low hum of voices, voices that carried unmistakable weight. 3 men in impeccably tailored suits stepped inside, exuding an authority that left no doubt as to who truly mattered at this bank, the executives, the decision-makers, the very men whose nods shaped destinies in these hallowed halls. Leading them was a familiar figure, Richard Langford, CEO of Highland Crest Bank, a man well aware of who Dorian was. Richard's keen gaze swept the room before settling on Dorian, his face lighting up with recognition. "Dorian," he said, breaking into a smile, "what the hell are you doing here?" Linda froze as Dorian rose and shook Richard's hand firmly. "Hey Richard, it's been a while," Richard said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Still steering Bennett's strategies? Still expanding it?" Dorian replied smoothly while Linda's eyes darted between them, her grip tightening on the folder. Richard's easy smile faded as he looked at her. How long has Dorian been waiting? He asked. Silence fell. Linda opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Dorian let the silence hang, allowing its weight to settle over the room. About an hour and a half, he finally stated. Richard's expression remained largely unchanged, though Dorian noticed a slight twitch in his jaw. An hour and a half, Richard repeated in a deceptively light tone. You had Dorian Bennett waiting for an hour and a half. Linda scrambled for words. A scheduling issue, she murmured, while Richard's focus never wavered from Dorian. You should have called me directly, he said. I would have ensured you were taken care of. Dorian offered a small, knowing smile. I didn't think I needed to. Richard sighed, shaking his head, and turned to Linda with a tone both calm and final. Linda, step outside for a moment. Her face paled noticeably as her hands clenched into fists before finally relaxing. Of course, she muttered, rising abruptly and exiting without another word as the door clicked shut. Richard then turned back to Dorian, shaking his head again. I don't know what happened, he said, but I guarantee it won't happen again. Dorian remained silent. No words were needed, the damage had already been done. Though the door closed behind Linda, a tangible tension still permeated the room. Richard exhaled slowly, settling into a chair across from Dorian, while the other two executives exchanged knowing glances in silence. This isn't how we operate here, Richard finally stated, his tone steady yet clipped. Dorian tilted his head slightly. Seems like it is. Richard paused. No arguments, no excuses, because men at the top recognized when things had gone wrong, and he was already calculating just how big a problem this was. Dorian was far from an ordinary client. He had built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from scratch, and his reputation resonated deeply in influential circles. Now he carried a story. Seated with fingers steepled, Richard said, "Tell me what happened." Dorian recounted it all, the scheduled appointment, the agonizing wait, watching others being ushered in before him, Melissa's dismissive attitude, Linda's indifference, and the way he was treated like just another name on a list. Richard listened intently, joined by the other executives. When Dorian finished, a heavy silence fell before Richard exhaled. I appreciate your candor, and to be honest, I'm pissed. Dorian leaned back slightly. Why? He prompted. Richard let out a humorless chuckle. Because this is the sort of mishap that shatters reputations. We've worked too damn hard to cement this institution's credibility, and now I have to clean up a mess I wasn't even aware of. Turning to one of his executives, he ordered, ensure Linda is removed from the floor immediately. We'll discuss this later. The man nodded and departed without a word. Richard then refocused on Dorian. That loan application you submitted, I assume it's solid? Dorian tapped his briefcase. See for yourself. Richard flipped through the folder, barely advancing past the first few pages before shaking his head. This shouldn't even be up for debate. Exchanging a sharp glance with one of the remaining executives, he added, fast-track it, I expect an approval on my desk by the end of the day. Dorian raised an eyebrow, and Richard met his steady gaze. You should have had it 2 hours ago. I'm remedying the mistake. Dorian realized this wasn't about generosity or mere error correction, it was about control, about damage containment, ensuring that this narrative stopped at these doors and did not spill into unwanted territory. He understood that game better than anyone, but he wasn't about to let Richard off easily. I'll accept the approval, he said as he stood, but fixing this for me doesn't resolve the underlying issue. Richard's expression remained impassive, though something in his eyes flickered. We'll have a long conversation about that, he said. Dorian picked up his briefcase, nodded once, and headed for the door, yet before leaving, he locked eyes with Melissa one last time. Her gaze was no longer confident. The summer heat pressed against Dorian's skin as he stepped outside. The bank's pristine facade gleamed under the midday sun, but inside, the fissures had begun to show. This was not merely about a loan, it wasn't even solely about Linda, it was about something far larger, a recurring pattern manifesting in 1,000 subtle ways. It wasn't always loud or overt, but it was ever-present, the assumption that some belonged in those inner offices while others were destined to wait, the quiet dismissals, the polite rejections, the artfully constructed barriers that were always conveniently excused. But not today. Today, accountability was demanded, and the next time Linda Kramer scanned her appointment list, she would think twice. A glance at his phone confirmed it. A new email declared his loan approved. A wry smirk curled Dorian's lips as he tucked the message away and walked toward his car. Respect isn't granted, it's demanded, and today he had secured exactly that. If you've ever found yourself in such a predicament, if you've ever felt that your time, your presence, your business was undervalued, speak up. Don't wait for permission, claim your rightful seat at the table. And if they dare keep you waiting, make sure they never forget the cost of that mistake.